I think in some of the previous stories that I told, I mentioned that when Ted died, there were 5 antique cars that he had that I had to do something with, sell or something. And there's some interesting stories about getting rid of those 5 cars. The first one was about a month after he died. A man from the church came and said, "I want to buy one of Ted's antique cars." And I said, "Which one?" He said, "I don't care. I just want one, something that he loved, and I want to have one of those cars." So he looked them all over, and he settled on the 1926 touring car. After that, a lot of times at church, he would tell me how much he enjoyed driving the old car. The second one to go was the Studebaker, and that was within that year, and it was bought by a young man who was in the Studebaker Club and knew what a good car it was. And he paid the price that I asked without any questions. And so that took care of those first 2, gave me some cash flow, which helped while I was getting other legal things settled, like getting part of our annuity to help my salary, because I didn't have a real large teacher retirement because I didn't start teaching until I was 38 years old and had only taught 22 years. And when I went to apply for the widow's benefits of my husband's Social Security, I fell under the offset law that said if you had your own retirement, you would lose dollar for dollar what you could get from your husband's retirement of Social Security. And so the first year, my Social Security check was $18 a month. And so I needed that cash that I got from these cars to help get by the first 2 years. Well, about 2 or 2.5 years later, I got a call from a man from Temple who was in the Model A Club. And he asked if I still had the Model A that Ted had, because he knew it was a good car. And I said, yes, I did. And he said, well, do you want to sell it? And I said, well, if I could get what it's worth. He said, well, he had a man there who was looking for an antique car, and he wanted a Model A. And he'd already looked at a Model A with a rumble seat there in Temple. And he liked it, but I mentioned this one, so could they come and look at it? And I said, yes, of course. And so they came, and they backed it out and drove it and everything. And the man said he liked it, and he wanted to go home and talk to his wife, as he said, I kind of like the one with the rumble seat too. So I thought, well, that's probably the end of that. But about 2 months later, I got a call on the phone, and it was from that same man, and he said, you remember me? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I've decided to buy your car if it's still for sale. And I told him it was. And so he drove over, and he pulled a trailer in behind his truck and said that, I'll tell you why I decided on yours. He said, I went home and I told my wife that I really liked the Model T, and I liked both of them, but I liked the one with the rumble seat the best. But he said, what I didn't tell you was one of the reasons we're looking for an antique car. Our son and his wife left their 3 children with us when they went for dinner for their 10th wedding anniversary, and on the way back, they were killed in a car wreck, both of them. And now we have these 3 children to raise, and one's a baby. And my wife said, you buy that with a rumble seat and you put that baby in there, he'll fall out and get hurt. So you just go get that one that he can't get out of the back seat. And so he bought it and hauled it on his trailer and left. But when he and the man from Temple had looked, that man had also said, do you still have that 1915 Model T pickup that he had restored? And I said, yes. He said, can we look at it? And they did. So about 2.5 years after he bought that Model A, this same man called again. He was from Bastrop, and he said, do you remember me? And I said, yes. And he said, we have had so much fun taking those children in parades, and my wife even named the car Daisy May, and she's learned how to drive it too. And he said, I told her about that pickup that was a 1915 restored Model T pickup, and we decided we might buy it, and she could drive the Model A in the parades, and I could drive the pickup in the parades, and we would name it Little Abner. And I said, well, I still have it if you want to buy it. Well, he came and she came with him. And when he looked at it and all, he said, yes, I want it, and I have to have the trailer it's in so I can keep it from getting dirty and all that, because it was stored in a trailer. And I said, well, that'll cost you an extra $500 for the trailer. He said, that's okay. And I said, I also have some spare tires that I won't need if these cars are going to be gone. So I gave him those, and he loaded those in the trailer. And his wife was sitting in the big dually truck, and they hooked up the trailer with the 1915 car behind it. We drove over to Lorena to the place where you could get your car titles and all that, and transferred the title over, and he didn't question me on the money, and that's how I sold that one. Then I only had the 37 Bantam left to get rid of. A lot of people looked at it, but they only offered me about half of what it was worth, and I wouldn't sell it for that. And I guess 10 years went by, and one day Angela called from Houston and said, Mom, I was working in my flower bed today, and I heard this old car comes down the street, and I looked up and waved at the man, and he honked, ooga, ooga, and then he backed up and stopped. He was in a Model T, and I recognized the sound of it, and I told him it made me think of my dad because he had had antique cars. And he asked if you had any left. She said, yes, just one, something like, I think it's called a Bantam. And he got all excited. You mean a little small car? She said, yes. Oh my, those are very rare. Do you think your mother wants to sell that? She said, well, I'm sure she will if she could get what she's asked. And so she said, gave me his name and said he wants to come and see it, and he will call you. I gave him your phone number, and he'd like to come up to look at it. And I said, that'll be fine. So he called the next week and asked if he could come, and he and his wife drove in, and he backed that car out. And I had gotten my grandson, Joseph, who was home for the weekend, over to change the oil or whatever it might need before the man looked at it. And it was in spick and span because Joseph washed it also. And he looked at that car, and she sat in their vehicle. She wouldn't come in the house. She just waited on him. He spent about 4 hours going over that car, driving it, starting it, opening the trunk, looking at everything. And then he said, I'm really interested in it. I'm going to go home and talk to my person that helps me with antique cars and let him talk to me and see what I think. Well, I knew that I had to get at least $10,000 or not let it go. And so about a month went by, and he called back, and he said, I want to buy that car if we can come to terms on it. And I said, well, he said, I'll come, bring my son, and we'll look at it again. And I said, that'll be fine. So they did. And when they drove in, they were pulling an empty trailer. I thought, this man is serious about buying this car. So he looked at it again, his son, and they talked. And he said, I think I could probably go $10,000, but I don't know if you'll sell it for that. And then I remembered that Ted had said to me once, when you sell a car, always ask for more than you'll take, because you can always come down, but you can't go up. And so I said, well, I was thinking more on the order of about $16,000. And he said, oh, no, I can't pay that much. And so I said, well, what would you think about splitting the difference? I'll come down $3,000 and you go up $3,000. I can do that, he said. And so we went to the Lorena place and signed over the title, and I sold that car and actually got a little more than I would have sold it for if he hadn't agreed. Well, that was the stories of the antique cars and getting rid of those. A lot of other stories with my family, very, very interesting. And also, I did a lot of things with my church. As an elder in the church, I was on a rotating schedule to serve at the communion table or give the offertory message. And I was also to take communion to shut-ins, which I did. And I served as a worship leader. And I also, in my Stephen ministry, worked with other people who had some kind of a problem they were dealing with, mostly especially widows who were grieving. I enjoyed all that work. And I also enjoyed singing in the choir and playing handbells. And that required practices for those two things during the week. So with my Sundays at church and my practices on that, and my disciples' women, which met also, I was staying busy between that and my teaching, retired teacher activities. And then, since I had been a teacher, sometimes people would ask me to substitute for them on a Sunday if they had to be out of town or something. And then about 2005, something like that, Jack Denman, who taught our Sunday school class, called me and said, could you take over the class for a while? I need a break. So I agreed to do that. And I became the teacher of that couples class. And it had been originally 20 couples, so about 40 people in the class. But some of the spouses began to die off, and my husband was one of the first that died. And eventually, we were down to about 20 people, and then about 15, and others then started moving where children were or going into nursing homes or something, and the class dwindled and got smaller. But as I taught it, I tried to teach a good lesson. I used not only the international Sunday school material, but I used a book once by Alan Stringfellow, who it was called Great Characters of the Bible, and we went through all the characters of the Bible individually. Another time, I used a book called The Prophets, and I got men in the class to take the part in that and be the prophet that talked like Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah, whichever one it was, and that gave them something and a little variety to the class. Then I taught also from one of Beth Moore's books about David, which was called A Heart Like His Heart. And they enjoyed it, and it went along fine, except it got smaller as people died off. When we got down to having about 5 or 6 on Sunday morning is all, one of the ladies said, "Virginia, you prepare such a good class, but it's not right for us to make you do that every week. Why don't we join with another couples class that had been formed since then, and they could use more people?" And I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. So we did, and we joined in that class, and then occasionally I would substitute for that teacher when they couldn't be there. Well, while I was teaching that class, one of the lessons that we had was from Matthew, 25th chapter, where he said, Jesus gave this command, pray to the Lord of the harvest to raise up workers, for the fields are white unto harvest and the workers are few. And I said, this is something Jesus said for us to pray for. We should be praying every day when we give our prayers for the Lord to raise up more ministers and missionaries. And so I began praying that every day myself. And I think that was a worthwhile thing. And I continued working at the church. I always helped with Vacation Bible School in the summer. And I worked the pumpkin patch in October when we would have that, which is an outreach for our community that our church puts on for the city of Waco. But you know, God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. And Michael Nicosia, Alicia's son, was in college studying for pharmacy in Houston. And Taylor had gone to Ouachita Baptist School with a dance major. And I expected to hear she's one day going to, Broadway dancing because she was so good. But suddenly, Taylor calls and says she's quitting school. She's going to go to Kansas City with this gospel group for the summer. She didn't know if she's going back in the fall or not. And Michael comes home from a mission trip he'd gone with his church in Houston and tells his mom he's going to quit college and become a missionary. And they did. I had some soul searching to do with that. I had to confess to God that when I prayed for workers to be brought up, I wasn't talking about my own grandchildren. But that's how things go. And I realized now, later, that was not because I prayed, but that he had those plans for them. And that was his way of letting me begin to accept that idea and be for it. And they have both turned out to be wonderful people, working in their churches where they are. And Michael took seriousness. He left college and went to a school north of Dallas where he studied mission work. And that year he was culminated with 6 weeks hands-on training in India. And then the next year, he went the whole year around the world. He spent 3 months in Central America, 3 months in Europe, 3 months in Thailand, in that area, and 3 months in Africa. And at the end of the time, when he was to come home, there was an outbreak of malaria, and some of the doctors at a place in an orphanage in Africa were ill, and so he actually stayed 3 more months, worked in that Heidi Baker orphanage while he was already over there. And unbeknownst to me, but I guess his mother knew, all that time he was corresponding with somebody that he had met through his cousin Taylor that had been in dance school with her. Her name was Leslie Dockery, and she was in college and got her BA and MA from Sam Houston, studying education and a minor in dance therapy. And when they came home, they announced that they were going to get married. In the meantime, Taylor met her husband also during this mission work, and his name was Michael Jaffe. Played the guitar and they sang together, and so they were getting married. And then my grandson DL met somebody named Becky Hottie, and he got married. So we had, from 2010 to 2014, lots of marriages. DL and Becky married in 2010, and Bailey was born, their first child, the following year in 2011. Taylor married in 2011, and or maybe 2012. But she married Michael Jaffe in a very nice ceremony. And then Michael and Leslie married in 2014. Stefan's daughter, Madeline DePass, also had a baby, and his name was Spencer. So they had suddenly quite a few grandchildren and great-grandchildren for me. David and Aaron also got married that same October in 2014. And with the new grandchildren and great-grandchildren, my family was really growing. I was still involved greatly with the Waco Federation of Music Clubs, and Texas music clubs were going to be 100 years old in March of 2015. And so they asked our Waco Euterpian group to come up with songs from 1915 to 2015. And they wanted something from 1915 to 1935 to show songs that would have been sung during the 100th year. And so I wrote a medley, or I put it together, of songs from World War I, and we learned that, and that's what our chapter did at the state convention. It was held in Brownwood. It was a 3-day affair, and so we practiced, and we did that, and it was very well received. And we even got our picture made and was in the paper later. And we had a great time at that convention. High with all these new babies and fun with the music club. And I was on a high when I drove home on that Saturday of March 21st from the convention, which had been 19th, 20th, and 21st. And when I drove into the driveway, Ted and Annette were there waiting to tell me that Levi had been killed on a motorcycle wreck in Colorado. Levi's business had been doing very well. After his graduation from art school, he had his own warehouse and place where he painted signs on the sides of vehicles. He also painted signs for businesses, and he painted and designed T-shirts for businesses. And he was doing very well, and that year even had been the 100th anniversary of the statehood of Colorado, and they had a beard growing contest, and Levi won that beard growing contest. And Schick Razor Company had contacted him to do a series of TV commercials, where the first one, they would trim his beard, and then they would make it shorter, and they would maybe move it to just a mustache and a goatee, and then continue on with their Schick things until they finally shaved him, showing all the different varieties of Schick razors. It was to be a very lucrative financial thing for him. He made only one of those commercials, and then he was killed in this accident. Not his fault. He was riding, coming around a curve on his side of the road, and a woman driving a vehicle, either talking to a passenger or on her phone, crossed the center stripe and killed him instantly, along with the person who was riding with him. Well, so the next week, Ted and Annette went to Colorado to help take care of closing his warehouse and whatever they needed to do. And we had a ceremony at memorial service at Central Christian Church in Waco for Levi. It was very traumatic on all of us, especially Annette, his mother. And I'll start next time telling what we did with the things from Levi and things that came out of that, and what came on after that year of 2015, which had been like the cycle of life. Babies born, young adults choosing ministry for life, others being killed, birth to death, 2015.